Arizona. Start that over. My name is Millicent Pepion, and I recently graduated with a PhD in American Indian Studies from the University of Arizona. My dissertation, it connected census to voter suppression in Arizona through 4 manuscripts. And that's what this manuscript is, chapter 3 of my dissertation, which is available on my website, reddataconsulting.com. So anyhow, just to begin, I'd like to thank the Indigenous Alliance Without Borders for sponsoring this event. As you may or may not know, the mission of the Alianza is to affirm the rights of Indigenous peoples, their right to sovereignty and self-determination, their collective human and civil rights, the rights of mobility and passage, and the protection of Mother Earth and sacred sites. For more information about the Alianza, including how to donate and volunteer, please visit. They have a Facebook page at www.facebook.com/Indigenous Alliance Without Borders. And you can also go directly to their website, indigenousalliance.org. But it's a really great organization. And I had the honor of interning for the Alianza for a couple semesters that I was completing my program. And I'd really like to thank Dr. Gonzalez for her help in establishing and really taking over the Alianza after Jose passed away. And I also would like to offer a moment of silence for Dr. Roberto Rodriguez. His name was also Dr. Simply. He helped me a lot with my dissertation these last 2 years. And so I would just like to take a moment of silence to honor him and his legacy. Okay. Moving forward, this overview is about the census, and a lot of people don't understand like why the census is so important. When I was working for the Intertribal Council of Arizona, which holds contracts for 21 of the 22 tribes in Arizona, in 2020, our job was to not only tell people about tell Native peoples about participating in the U.S. Census, but it was also to increase Native voter suppression in Arizona. And every 20 years, the census and the presidential election happens the same time. It's a very important time for Native peoples, but it's also an important time for America and all Christian nations, which are largely regarded as first world nations. For those of you who don't know, the census is in the Bible. There's actually a chapter called Numbers, and that's all about a census. And even if you look at if you ever read Genesis, it is a detailed census. It's like, this is the son of this, and he was also had these 5 children, and those children married this children. So the census is embedded in the Christian Bible. It is the first few chapters of the Christian Bible, and it's also featured throughout the Christian Bible. And I pulled out a quote right here from Luke. It said, in those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinus was governor of Syria, and all went to be registered, each to his own town. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. And so a lot of people don't understand, or maybe I didn't, and I say a lot of people like myself, I didn't know that when Mary and Joseph were heading to Bethlehem, when the Star of David came, that they were actually going there to do a census. And that the reason why Jesus was born in the manger that he was is because, and not in his home, was because his family was partaking in the census. That was mandatory by the Christian government at the time. So, like I said, the census is a foundation of all Christian nations. It is a part of all of the United Nations. The census is ordered in the US Constitution. It is Article 1, Section 2. There have only been 23 US censuses in US history. And President Jefferson was the first secretary to oversee the first US Census. The thing that I like about Thomas Jefferson, and he was kind of a main point early on in my dissertation research, and that is because of the extensive work that he did. This is the electronic edition of Notes on the State Virginia. This is the only full book that was published by Thomas Jefferson. It was published before he became president, actually before he became the nominal director of the US Census. This was a study that was ordered by the French Prime Minister at the time, who later on negotiated the Louisiana Purchase with President Jefferson in 1805. However, what I like about this Notes on the State of Virginia is that, hold on one second. Okay, so what I like about this, and if you look at the table of contents, his census looked at the boundaries of the Commonwealth of Virginia. It was not a state. It became a state a year after Notes of Virginia was published. He looked at the rivers, the mountains, the Cascades, the type of vegetables and animals that were able to sustain there. He looked at the climate for the different years. The thing about Thomas Jefferson was his dad was a geographer, and actually his dad wrote or drew up the first map of Virginia. And his dad was very adamant about knowing the land, including the vegetation, the water, the mountains, and all of the, he even put like marine force, not just the human populations, but he did distinguish between the enslaved people's populations and the native people's populations, as well as the immigrant populations that were coming into Virginia. He also he went around on horseback and counted every building and looked at the structures of the buildings. And he determined that every 50 years that a building can really only sustain for 50 years if it's made of wood. And so he was looking at buildings when they were built and when they would have to be refurbished or rebuilt. He looked at also a survey of the religions and how money was being counted and measured during that time. One thing that very much interested me about this book are the many different tables that he offers. As I said, these are map tables of all of the different animals that are in here. But the thing that interests me the most was the tables regarding the, who he called the Aborigines, which are the indigenous peoples of Virginia. And so you can see here, this is the early on the first census of Virginia. It explains the populations from 1607 until 1780 or 1782. These other ones were added like 1862. The book that was, oh wait, actually that would be right there. Wait, no, because this book was published in 1776. Yeah, so some of this information was added on in later publishings. But as you can see here, he numbers the number of free males. And if you look right along here on this next page, he starts talking about the tribes. And I didn't even know much of these tribes existed. Wampanoags, Pawnee, Hassanugas. The thing that's interesting about these tribes is that they were so radically different that translators needed to be implemented when they were doing business amongst themselves. Like these tribes were not the same at all. They did not speak the same language. They did not have the same ceremonies. They were very different tribes. And you can see these populations in 1607 And then after war and battle, you can see how far they've gone down. And these were smaller tribes too. You know, some of them maybe only had 20 people. But I just found that very interesting, that population of Native peoples can just be eradicated to where we don't even know these tribes anymore. And none of these tribes are recognized. In the state of Virginia, I think maybe the Monahawks are, but in the state of Virginia, there are 11 state recognized tribes. Of those, only 2 of them have reservations, and the reservations only total about 5 acres of land. One of them is north of West Point, and the other one is like west of West Point, which is like a big military school. But the rest of the tribes in Virginia do not have, although they do have state recognition. I think 7 of them have federal recognition. None of them really have any land, and the land that they do have just has like a church. And so anyhow, I thought that was very interesting, and it kind of made me think about, like, what is Arizona's tribes going to be like in 250 years from now, if this is how these tribes are 250 years ago. So from here, we move on to what is the U.S. Census. So the U.S. Census, for most people who don't know, is actually carried out by the Department of Commerce. The Department of Commerce also oversees the Bureau of Industry and Security, Minority Business Development, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Interestingly, it also is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which I look at a lot. They study the weather. It also looks at the U.S. patent. So things that are related to business is what the U.S. Census kind of is housed in the same area as the U.S. Census, and the U.S. Census is its own department. For everyone, so there's U.S. Census. When the U.S. Census does its national census every 10 years, they do go around to every household and request that people partake in a 9-question survey. I will go through those questions in a second, but they also look at the things that, like Thomas Jefferson looked at, like the water levels, how many businesses there are, how much money those businesses bring in, how much agriculture there is, how much agriculture is sustaining in a certain area. And so for individual households, however, the census is, just like I said, it's a 9-question survey. You could do it in person, by mail, or online. And they really encouraged it online because of the pandemic. It was the only census in U.S. history that actually had to make, concessions in order to accommodate the global pandemic that was happening at the time. So why is the census important? The U.S. Census is important because all federal funding is based on U.S. Census data. So programs like WIC, TANF, SNAP, SSI, Medicaid, Medicare, the workforce initiatives, HUD housing, IHS, BIA, BIE is all based on census data. And so what that means is they look at specifically, like, we'll just take WIC, for example. If there's a group that says that we want to have a WIC office in our community because we have a whole bunch of women here who are having to travel several miles in order to get benefits for their children, they don't have cars, the bus is limited, the federal government asks to see the census data for that block. And what they look for specifically is how many women registered that are within the childbearing age, which they qualify as 16 to 34. So if there's a significant amount of women between the ages of 16 to 34 within a certain census block, that justifies a WIC program. Likewise, the census does Meals on Wheels. And so if you want to have like a food program for elders, you have to have a certain number of people over the age of 65 within a certain area in order to qualify for Meals on Wheels program or any kind of senior service programs that are provided by the federal government. Even states, though, they also use census data to determine those same departments. So if you are looking for state funding for social services, the states are also going to utilize census data. They also utilize their own data that they collect between censuses. But for the most part, even states kind of look at census data, but the federal government only looks at census data. The federal government does not consider any other data other than the census when it's building programs, social service programs for populations in a certain area. All representation, that means all of your federal representatives in US Congress, all of your state representatives, and for us it'd be the Arizona State Legislature, and all of your county commissioners and the county districts are all influenced by census data. And so that's another reason why. And that's because within a 10-year period, populations may, like, for example, I can think of one, like Chandler, Arizona, never was as populated as it was now when I was growing up in the 1990s. I remember it used to just be fields and fields of like agriculture. We used to drive down those roads, and that's where we got our fruits and vegetables. Now, if you drive down Arizona Avenue, it's like all housing. And so that's just one example of how the populations change. And so these are all weighted. So the federal government is 750,000 per district. The states are around 375,000 per district, and the counties, it depends on how many people are in the county. But they try to be equally divided between 3 or 5 districts. And those change based every 10 years, those redistricts are redrawn. So moving on, why is the US Census important for Native peoples? The US Census is important for Native peoples because although we are our own nations, we do not conduct our own census like other nations do around, like all of the nations that belong to the United Nations, for example. They all conduct their own census. But US nations, they do not conduct their own census. With that being said, there has been censuses that have been conducted by tribes. For example, the Tohono O'odham Nation, they conducted their own census. And I forget what year, in like 2006 or 2016. I'm not sure about the years. And then the Navajo Nation also tried to conduct their own census. But those were more retaliatory censuses. They were kind of saying that the numbers that were produced by the federal government did not actually reflect their communities. A census is consistent. A census happens every 10 years. It doesn't happen once because they're trying to prove a point. And it doesn't happen to prove a point. It happens to help be the foundation of their government processes. So in my opinion, those censuses weren't actual official censuses because they weren't done or carried out in the way that official census, like the US Census, is carried out, which is consistently gathered every 10 years and made to influence district lines and made to influence funding and also plan for future the next 10 years. With that being said, tribes rely on federal census data, and that's because we rely on the government to supplement our economies. A lot of nations do not have their own hospitals. They are run through IHS programs, which the IHS divvies up funding based on the number of Native peoples that participated in the US Census. And so if a tribe has a hospital on their reservation and they only have listed 5,000 people, then they'll only get funding for 5,000 people. They won't get additional funding. So it's very important that tribes do participate in the US Census because it funds a lot of, and that's just one example, but it funds like BIE, the Bureau of Education. So all of the schools, it funds the Bureau of Indian Administration, which oversees a lot of the federal contracts for tribes, including land management, water management contracts. And even things like the Meals on Wheels program. At ITCA, when we were working there, we used to talk about the Havasupai tribe. They had wanted to implement a Meals on Wheels program for the elders in their community down there in Supai Village, but they were denied because they didn't meet the minimum 50 elders. Even though they had about 70 elders, and the Intertribal Council tried to advocate on behalf of the Supai village that they did have enough elders to advocate for a Meals on Wheels program, but because they did not have that federally counted, they were not able to make a Meals on Wheels program there for their elders. Tribes also do not have a vote in federal, state, or county governments. So tribes don't have a vote in US Congress. Any federal bills that are passed are not influenced by tribes, are not voted on or introduced by tribes, unless individual tribal members run for those districts. The tribes really have no say in what the federal government votes into law. Also, that carries on into the state legislature. The tribes, the 22 nations here in Arizona, and even the unrecognized nations that we mentioned in the land acknowledgement, they do not have a vote in the Arizona state legislature. They do not have a say in Arizona state law. And that also carries on individually into counties. What's interesting, however, is that federal, state, and county districts cross reservations, and the federal, state, and county laws affect the nations that they overlap. So it is something for tribes to think about. And we'll talk about that later down the line, and when I talk next week about districts and how those affect Native peoples living on reservations and also those living off reservations. But for the most part, unless a member of a Native nation is running for that district, then that Native nation really, and there's rules by the Native nation that say that if an enrolled member is representing a federal district, that they consult with the nation if they're a member of that nation. So it has to be like a law on the tribal side. It has to be a tribal representative who wins that district. And then there has to be some type of negotiation between that position to make sure that the tribes are fairly represented for that county or for that district. Anyhow, that's a separate conversation that we'll go into like next week, because that gets very messy, considering that federal, state, and county districts also overlap each other. And that's kind of what this is talking about in number 4. So if you want to know about the complexities of federal, state, and county districts and how those influence peoples on reservation, Native peoples on reservations, and Native peoples off reservations, tune in next week. So I'll accidentally go on, and I don't want to. So anyhow, getting back to the census, there are 4 questions that these are the first 4 questions when you go take the online survey, or if a census worker comes and knocks at your door, or if you get a little mail-in about the survey. These are going to be the first 4 questions. They want to know how many people are living in your home, apartment, or mobile home, and they choose the April 1st date. This is actually known, it's a federal recognized holiday. You don't get it off though, but it is like it's recognized by the U.S. Census Bureau, U.S. Department of Commerce, and it's April 1st, 2020. There's a lot of barbecues usually that happen on this day, trying to encourage people to take the census. But while you're answering these questions for the census, you usually look to that date in order to answer it. So how many people are living or staying in your dwelling, in your place of dwelling, as of April 1st, 2020? Because as you know, and we have this a lot, we have a lot of Native peoples who maybe come down to the city and live here in the dormitories for the spring, and then when summer comes, they go back home for the reservation. And so when they count Native peoples, they count them here when they're living, wherever they're living on April 1st is where they're counted. They ask how many people are in that home on April 1st. Same reason, people move out of the home, in and out of the home. And so you look at that April 1st, like how many people were living there on April 1st? If that's a hard question for you to answer. My daughter moved out and she took her 3 kids. So what do I answer? Were they living with you on April 1st? Okay, then they were living with you on the census. Then they ask, do you live in a house, apartment, or mobile home? The census is very particular about having a certain set of answers. They do not say, were you living in a hogan? Were you living in a, were you homeless? Like, were you living in a tent? Were you living in your car down by the river? Those are house, apartment, mobile home, and for homeless people, they have a separate answer, like for homeless. But if you live in a hogan, for example, they count that as a house. Because that's an immovable single house. It's a single household permanent structure. An apartment is a permanent multi community, and then a mobile home is a structure that can be moved. And so that's how they kind of determine what kind of house you live in. And then of course, you answer that as of April 1st. And then what's your telephone number? And that's because if they have any issues in how you answered your question, like, because some people will be like, if they do live in a hogan, they might say they live in a house. They might answer 2 of these, because technically you can move hogans. Or something, if there's any issue where somebody answers 2 or more of these, then they have to call you and clarify your answer. And if you're unable to answer by yourself, then you will talk to a US Census worker and they will help clarify the answer for you. Moving on to the next 5 questions. These all have to do with individual persons. So these 5 questions are answered for each person that's listed living in your home. So over here on question 2, it said, or question 1, how many people are living in your home? And you say 3 people, then they have the head of household is person 1, and then the next adult living in the house is person 2, and then the children are listed last in order of their birth. And so person 1, like I said, is the head of the household. They ask, what is person 1's name? They ask, what is person 1's sex? It is only male or female. That is because of the WIC requirements and also other requirements, like for the workforce programs for WIOA. For those programs, they do want to know how many men are living in a certain community. They also like to know how many men are living in a certain community, because men over the age are, when a boy child turns 18, they have to register for the US Army. And so they look at census data to make sure that communities are in compliance for those kind of questions. And especially during times of war, like when 9/11 happened, that was something that was very, that was highly of interest for the US Army to know how many men over the age of 18 to the age of 40 lived in a certain community that could potentially register as or become US soldiers and fight on behalf of the US Army. They look at a person's age. So everyone changes, you know, every year. You have a birthday. My birthday is going to be in like, I don't know, 16 days. As of April 1st, I was 37. That's what I would list on the census. Even if I took the census in October, I would still say that I was 37 on April 1st. And then you have to list your date of birth. So a lot of people actually don't know that they answer that wrong. Even though it says everywhere on the census, answer like it's April 1st. Even if you're taking the census on December 1st, answer like it's April 1st. And so that's one of the questions that are changed a lot. And then another thing is people who are pregnant or about to have their child, if they are going to be due by December 31st, then you count them as being born on April 1st. You count them as an infant. But if they're not going to be born, like let's say you're 3 months pregnant in October, then you don't count them at all, which is, it's kind of iffy. I know there's rules, and they have like a certain set of rules that they follow by, and that's one of them. And that can be confusing for women who are carrying children. You look at that April 1st date, how far along are you? And if you are far along enough to say that you're going to have a child before December 31st of that census year, then you count that child. But if it's going to be due the next year, then you don't count the child. Is the person Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin? This is one thing that me and Dr. Simply talked about a lot, and he really wanted this to be a part. Hold on one second. This is something that was really interesting to us because we there is a high, like especially in states like Arizona, New Mexico, California, and Texas, there is a high number of people who are quote unquote Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin. They do not have their own race. People from Central, South America, and the Caribbean islands have to register either as being white, which is what the majority have done for the last 100 years, have registered as white. And from 2010 to 2020, there's been that same Hispanic, Latino, Spanish origin population has tripled in some areas. For example, in Cochise, Santa Cruz, and Yuma County, the native populations have like almost tripled in all of those counties. We see like a growing number of people of that ethnicity, not identifying as white anymore, but identifying as being native. That's boosted our numbers a lot and has increased our eligibility for more federal funding for our programs, for Native people's programs. Of course, if you're not a member of a federally recognized nation, you are not eligible for any of those services. So we do appreciate that there's more people from this ethnicity that are identifying as our race, the American Indian, Alaska Native race, because it is justifying more funding and representation for our communities. But again, that's because they don't have their own race. And so these are the 15 races right here that you can pick. You say that you're white, you notice that they do not include any countries from Central or South America on here. They just give an example of German, Irish, English, but a lot of people don't know that Mexico is one of these white countries. And also like Guatemala, Honduras. And then we have the Black race, also African-American race. And then we have the American Indian, Alaska Native race. And then we have distinguishing races for different Asian countries, such as the Chinese race, the Filipino race, Asian Indian, Vietnamese, Korean, Japanese. They all get to be their own separate races. So that means that they're eligible for their own separate funding and their own separate representation in the United States. You can also see that Native Hawaiians, they are not included in the American Indian or Alaska Native race. And neither are Samoan. I don't know what Chamorro is. I should have looked that up before I came on here. And then these other three are of interest as well for my work. Other Asian, such as, Cambodian, Pakistani, and then other Pacific Islands, Tongan. And then we have this some other race category, which this population right here that are not eligible for federal funding or federal representation, the Hispanic, Latino, and Spanish origin ethnicity, if they're not registering as the white race, like they have historically done for the last 100 years, and they are not registering as the American Indian or Alaskan race, which they are recently, that's a phenomenon that's occurred since the 2010-2020 census, then they're registering as some other race. And then they'll write in here Mexican. And so you'll see that if you look at data from Cochise, Santa Cruz, and Yuma County, you'll see that it's 70, like 75, I'm just throwing these numbers out here, and we're going to look at the 2020 census in a second, but just example, 75% white, and then 5% Native. And then if you do the math, that means that there's 20% of some other race. And it's a growing race in Arizona, is some other race. And so when I was bringing this issue up with Dr. Simply, he told me that he knew that was a problem in the United States, that this group of peoples here from Central South America and the Caribbean islands are not eligible for federal funding or federal representation. And they are not eligible to use things such as the Civil Rights Voting Act. Because they're listed as white, it justifies the majority white representation in that county. And so I made this a point on my dissertation that this is a problem with the US Census, that the brown population needs to have their own race, and they need to be distinguished from these 15 other races. And it cannot be relied upon them, writing in here some other race Mexican. Because the thing about writing Mexican is, like, you have to write it exactly Mexican. Or some people might write Mexico, or some people might write Sonoran, which is a state in Mexico. And when you do that, then you have populations that are, okay, we have 100 Mexicans, we have 100 people from Mexico, we have 100 people from the Sonoran state. Either way, they're all listed as some other race, but again, that's why they need to have their own, race, because it needs to be like centralized and easy for people to interpret this data, because it's very skewed and we'll look at that right now before I talk about it anymore. So yeah, that's what I was just talking about, is this thing, the Civil Rights Voting Act. It is very hard to substantiate these cases, even for Black and Native American peoples, especially for Native American peoples in Arizona. Even after we were, quote unquote, given the right to vote on reservations, Native peoples weren't given the right to vote until 1948 with the Harrison Levine case. But then even after that, they had literacy tests. And so, this Civil Rights Voting Act says, okay, how many minority people, let's just say, how many Native peoples live in this county? How many of those Native peoples are eligible to vote? How many of those Native peoples that are eligible to vote are voting? And then how many people actually voted in this county? And so if we look at it and we're like, oh, hey, there's 75,000 natives in Apache County. Of those, 40,000 of them are like over the age of 18. That means that they're eligible to vote. Some of them might be in jail. They might have lost their civil rights. They might have lost their right to vote. They might have lost their right to carry a firearm as well. But how many people actually registered to vote? let's say like 20,000 people registered to vote. Okay, how many of those people actually voted? Well, we only got 10,000 ballots. Okay, so that's something that's of interest. And if you get if those certain numbers click, then you can have a vote for the civil rights. You can raise a case that your community is subject to violations from the Civil Rights Voting Act. But like I said, if you're writing that you're white and you're Hispanic, Spanish, or from Central South America, and there's an overwhelming amount of people of that ethnicity that are in a community that are over the age of 18, that are eligible to vote, but it's not reflecting on the actual number of people that are voting. Normally, if that community was Black or Native American or any of the other 15, 13 races that are eligible for funding and representation, according to the US Census, then they would have a case against the civil rights, or they would have a case for the Civil Rights Voting Act. But as such, if you have a community of people who are registering as white and the representation there is white, non-Hispanic, then you really don't have a case to say that your community is not getting the same access to voting as another community. So with that being said, this is the first official US Census in Arizona. It happened in 1920. We were part of the 1860 New Mexico Territory Census. They have been doing censuses. So what's now considered Arizona was acquired through the Gadsden Purchase in 1848. But we weren't actually our own territory until like around the 1860s did Arizona become its own territory. Before that, we were part of the New Mexico Territory. And then it took like a few years for us to become our state. We became a state February 14th, 1912. And then, so we missed the census. They used the 1910 census information to substantiate our statehood into the United States. By the way, that's why we came 1912. If you notice, that's 2 years after the census was done in 1910, after the Arizona census. So the census actually kind of contributed to Arizona's statehood. As I said here, they do look at agriculture. They look at people over the age of 21. That's because they've always been interested in how many people are able to vote. In 1920, this was the only census that Arizona did where the population to vote was 21 and age or older. And so when they looked at that and they looked at the classes of people, they were looking at native white, which they considered second, third generation white, foreign white, which are people who maybe have immigrated here from countries like Germany or Ireland, England. Those are considered foreign-born white. Mexico is also in this category of foreign-born white, and I'll show you more about that. And then they looked at also the Black population in Arizona and in every state too. So if we come down here, and we're looking at the census per counties, it's beginning on page 11, but here are the square miles. These do fluctuate. I didn't realize that, but if you look at and compare the land per county from 1920 to 2020, there are distinctions. I omitted that from my dissertation research, but just throwing it out there, that's going down the rabbit hole. And then as you can see that they have the 1870, 1880, 1890, 1900, and 1910 censuses done for these areas as well. They have those listed. Native nations are down here. And so they're listed in the county. And you'll see that like it says right here, part. because, you know, Navajo Indians are also considered in Coconino County and Apache County. So it says like part of the Navajo reservation is here. And the total Navajo reservation is listed. I think it's in, yeah. So here's Navajo for total population of Fort Apache and Navajo Indian Reservation, see Apache County. So you come over here, but they do list the native, they do have like native peoples have their own precincts. And it's usually listed at the bottom. Some counties like Cochise County does not have an Indian reservation. Coconino County, it's listed here at the bottom. Moki, which was the other name for Hopis at the time. They were known as Moki people. And that's an issue too with Native nations. Hold on one second. So when you do measure or when you do count Native nations in the US Census, and this is something that Dr. Carol Lujan looked at, it has to be the exact name. So if you have people who are saying, oh, I'm Moki, and they write that they're Moki Indian, and then there's some people that are listed as Hopi, that's a potential, that means that they potentially are going to be counted as two separate races, even though it's the same group of peoples. That goes back to that same thing about, you know, if Mexican people, they're listing themselves as some other race, a group of them is writing Mexican, another group is writing Mexico, another group is writing Sonoran. Even though it's the same country, essentially, the US Census will count those as three different populations of races. And so there's one tribe specifically that we made it a point to very clearly, you know, make sure that they're writing on the US Census, and it's because of their name is so long, but it's the Salt River Indian hyphen Salt River Pima Indian Maricopa Community. Maricopa Indian Community is SRP MIC. Okay, so Salt River Pima, see, I can't even do this right. Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community. If you want that tribe to have its own funding and representation on the US Census, you have to have all of those people who claim that tribe to write it exactly that way. They have to write Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community. And we noticed that some people weren't even able to spell it in some instances. They were misspelling it. And that's something that, you know, we had to like really go. Here we go with Hualapai. It's now pronounced, or it's now spelled Hualapai, Hualapai, but in the 1920 census, it was known as the Hualapai. So if you did go now today, if you wrote it the other way, Hualapai, which some elders do, they do write it Hualapai, then that's not counted. And so anyhow, just throwing that out there, that you have to count it exactly. And these names have changed on the US Census. As you can see, this is Salt River Indian Reservation. Right now, their name is the Salt River Pima Indian Maricopa. Yeah, did you have a question, Lourdes?
Yeah, we have a question, but can we take a quick, maybe 5 or 7 minute break for people to use the restroom and stretch their legs out? And then we do have a question in the chat, so let's get ready to answer that question when people come back at 11:08.
Okay.
All right, so we'll be back. We're gonna do a quick 7 minute break, stretch your legs out, use the restroom. We'll be back at 11:08 and we'll be able to answer the question in the Q&A. So programs using, I'm reading one of these questions out loud. Do the people who decide programs using census data ever consult with experts who would know these details, like the tribal name changes, either at federal, state, or local level, or do they mainly just go unaddressed? it is still a problem, especially for members who do not know their federally recognized name or who use slang words such as Navajo instead of Navajo Nation. And
Did you want to,
yeah,
sorry,
go ahead. No, go ahead, JS.
did you want to answer these questions out loud, Millie? Or did you want me to read them off for you?
Yeah, it doesn't matter. I like to Lourdes was doing it.
Okay.
Yeah, I was looking at the first one because I did want to comment on it. There was an anonymous question that said, did you say Mexico is considered white? If so, do you know why? So a lot of the people from Mexico, they don't know what indigenous nation they're from. They're pretty mixed. And, you know, thanks to colonialism, a lot of people now consider themselves Mexican, even though that's a nationality. And another good example, not related to Mexico's issue, but it's still similar. So for example, my ex-husband, him and I, we share a son, and my ex-husband looks super native, like he's obviously native. And he does identify by his tribe, which is Mountain Ute, which is based out of Colorado. And they are a federally recognized tribe, but they make enrollment really hard for people to get enrolled into the tribe. And they have also disenrolled people from their tribe. So because my ex-husband cannot be enrolled in his tribe because of his tribe's enrollment requirements, he is listed under our son's birth certificate as white, even though he is not white. But when we were adding him to the birth certificate, the people that take your information from the vital records, they said, "Are you Mexican?" He said no. And then they said, "Are you Black?" And then he said no. And then they said, "Are you from a tribal nation?" And he said yes. But the only way he could list himself as Native American on our son's birth certificate is if he proved that he belonged to a federally recognized tribe, which is obviously an enrollment card. So because he had to say no to everything, they had to list him as white. So the default for the birth certificate is white for him. So that's another example. Let me see. I'm gonna look at the last question. Last question was, Alicia said, "I'm going to be doing some pretty in-depth research partially based on census data in the next couple months. Any recommendations, tips, etc. for someone who is a total amateur to make sense of this data and how to correct for the way the data is collected?" Yeah, Millie's dissertation is available online, and there's a lot of awesome information. And there you go. In the footnotes are important links regarding Arizona census history. Also, you should cite Dr. Carol Lujan, who has written several articles regarding the enumeration of Native peoples as a whole, which I should read too.
Yeah, she really is.
Yes.
And her articles were published by the Census Bureau. So wow. That's another thing that's why I started with her when I was doing my research. And then I kind of bridged from there. And just to kind of also go back to this other question, yes, if you look at here at foreign born white, since Arizona has become a state, you'll see here Mexico listed, and they have 60,000 people. So it's the majority of foreign born white are from Mexico, Central, and it's not just Mexico, it's all of Central America and all of South America. If you're from Brazil, you list yourself as white. Peru, and a lot of those countries don't recognize Native peoples. So that's another reason why Indigenous peoples aren't listed for those areas. But just to kind of hurry up here, like I've gone on and on about this. And I've kind of gotten away. Anyhow, there's also the link for the 2020 census. And yeah, if we could make the brown race, because there is the white race and the black race, and if we could make the brown race, it would significantly change the white race forever in the United States. And you would look at, like, if you look at the US Senate or the US Congress, you'll see like the majority of people are white, non-Hispanic. And when you look at the data, you'll be like, oh, well, that makes sense, because in Arizona, the majority of people are white, but they're also white Hispanic. And so it would change Congress if we actually made the brown race if people from Central and South America had their own race, it would justify a more diverse Congress and a more diverse Arizona state legislature. So that's another reason why it's very important that before the 2030 census, peoples from Central and South America and also the Caribbean islands be designated their own race. And that's something that I advocate for in my dissertation. This is looking, you can look at all of this data. I'm not going to go through it, but you can see all the data per state, and then you can also click on the Hispanic origin, and you can so as you can see in Arizona, 30% are Hispanic or Latino, and that 30% have to register as either being a member of the white race, the Native American race, or some other race. So anyway, something I've gone away from myself on that like long enough, so I don't want to do it anymore. This is what I wanted to talk about was Native American peoples in Pima County, because that's the majority of what this talk was supposed to be about. And anyhow, so this is the Tohono Nation. I'm not saying that right. But the Tohono Nation, it includes San Javier, which is a non-contiguous part of the reservation. Between San Javier and the majority, the 2.8 million acres that we largely consider the Tohono Nation, there is the Pasquayaqui tribe and their villages, which we'll get to soon. The O'odham Empire itself was a very extensive empire. They were the largest tribe in this area. Their traditional territory goes all the way from the Sonoran state, the northern part of the Sonoran state, all the way up past Phoenix and Wickenburg. And that was all O'odham area. When the United States came in, after they acquired this land in 1848 with the Gadsden Purchase, they immediately divided the O'odham peoples into separate groups. And then from those separate groups, they made them go down into the 4 groups that they now are in. Like the O'odham Juid and this group, the Hia Chid, those are unfederally recognized groups of O'odham people that did not receive their own land or recognition. These groups, the Ak-Chin, Gila River, and Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community, they had to accept peoples of Peeposh descent, which Peeposh people not only have a separate language, they have a separate diet. They're so different than the O'odham people, but in this last 80 years, really, because like in 1880 is when a lot of these reservations were designated, like especially this was the first reservation in Arizona, the Gila River Indian Community, which is an O'odham Peeposh reservation. Since 1880, which is only like 120 years, they're indistinguishable. You wouldn't be able to go like, oh, that's a Peeposh person, that's an O'odham person. They look and dress, and a lot of them speak only O'odham. Like a lot of the Peeposh people don't even speak Peeposh anymore. there's very few people who identify as being Pequash anymore, and that's because they were forced to join the O'odham communities, the O'odham nations, which I noted in my dissertation. The Tohono O'odham Nation includes 62 miles of the US border, and this is their history as far as the US Census goes. In 1920, there was 3,600. I only went back 50 years. So since 1920, the tribe has really only increased to 8,480, according to the United States government, according to the United States. Of course, if you were to merge this with the Auction, Gila River, and Salt River community, that number goes up to about 30,000 O'odham peoples that are federally recognized. And we don't include the O'odham Druid or the O'odham Sead, but that number would also increase too. Those numbers aren't known. And just a fun fact, the O'odham Reservation is the second largest reservation in the United States. The first largest reservation is in the Navajo Nation. So Arizona is home to the two largest Indian reservations in the country. And 27% of Arizona's land is reservations. And another, I forget, it comes out to like another 10%, like if you include the Grand Canyon, Tonto National Park, there's like another 5 to 10% that's federal land. So really only about 60% of Arizona is up for private ownership or corporate ownership. The Pasco Yaqui tribe is the first tribe to encounter the Spanish off the coast of Mexico. They literally greeted Cortez when he got off his ships. And that explains like why their flag has symbolisms of the Catholic Church, of the Roman Catholic Church. And that's because like it's this word called syncretism, but basically early on they were forced in order, and like these are like the Pueblos peoples of New Mexico, but in order to maintain their religions, because they had smaller populations, they had to actually change their religions to meet with the Catholic religion. And so the Yaqui calendar it largely coincides with the Roman Catholic Church calendar, as does the Pueblo. That was by design by the Yaqui people in order to sustain their cultures. Anyhow, that's a big whole other conversation about syncretism and how, tribes, were forced to work with the Roman Catholic Church in order to sustain their identities. But regardless, the Yaqui people were forced out of Mexico. They were forced to flee. There are still Yaqui people there by Rio Yaqui, but a lot of them were forced to flee out of Mexico out of persecution of genocide and violence. And so what we see in the United States and states like Arizona, New Mexico, California, Texas, Oregon, all the way up to Oregon, we have Yaqui communities. And so here in Arizona, there's 7 communities that are recognized, but a few of them are here in the Tucson area. There's New Pascua, Old Pascua, South Tucson, Marana, Guadalupe, Scottsdale. But like if you go to the University of Arizona, Helen, it's the street that's directly north of Speedway at Park. That's also a Yaqui community. So people wonder why there's a gate, the old main gate, and that was to keep out Yaqui agriculture. Like there was cows that used to come up, like Yaqui cows that used to come up on the campus. And so they built that old main gate there to keep out the Yaqui agriculture that was in the area. But the Yaqui people were there. They also have a little community, New Old Pascua, which is by like 5th Street in Grant. So you'll find little pockets of Yaqui everywhere. And yeah,
We have a question in the chat. It
Okay.
says, have other tribal populations slowly dropped in recent decades, like the Tohono O'odham?
The Tohono O'odham didn't drop, it's naturally increased. Are you talking about 2000 to 8,400? That is like, it's kind of, it can be an issue about people not spelling the Tohono O'odham Nation like that exactly on the census. Because like I said, they've done their own censuses, and if you look at the enrollment numbers, those don't match the enrollment numbers. So these are just census numbers, and this has nothing to, and that's why tribes don't really like census, is because it doesn't accurately reflect their own enrollment numbers or their own history that they have. This is just what the US government has said, but the Tohono O'odham Nation is very much thriving. And this number, please do not go by this number. This is just a number that they use to fund Tohono O'odham program, federal programs on the Tohono O'odham reservation. But it's not a number that reflects who they are and how they've increased. I'm sorry, I did not make that clear, but none of the information on the census should be trusted about tribes, because it doesn't reflect our own numbers, our own enrollment information. And tribes don't do their own censuses, so we don't really know how the Tohono O'odham Nation has progressed. That's and I'm not O'odham, so I couldn't answer that question anyway. The Yaqui people, they were designated a tribe on September 16th, 1978, and they were part of the official 1980 census. Before that, they weren't, even though they're what they were, a distinguished group of people. At that time, they only had 551 members. Today, they have 3,200 members, according to the US Census, not according to, these numbers aren't produced by the Pasco Yaqui tribe. So, but if we were just going to look at the numbers again, another reason why these numbers might not be true is because unless people write Pasco Yaqui tribe exactly like that, and they just write Yaqui, then they're also not counted as Pasco Yaqui tribe. They're counted as like a separate race of people. And so they're considered native, but they're not considered Pasco Yaqui tribe. And that might be the same for like if people write TO instead of writing Tohono O'odham Nation, then that's another reason why those numbers don't reflect the actual number of people that there are for that nation. For Pima County, these are Pima County statistics. Just going to focus over here on 2020. So in 2020, there were 1 million people registered in Pima County. Of those, 800,000 are white. Again, that can include people from Central and South America who would not be considered white by the police. And then the native population are people who may or may not be enrolled into an actual federally recognized tribe, but who identify as being American Indian or Alaska Native, who wrote on the census that they were. There's 55,844, so about 5.3% of the population. Keep in mind, there's a lot of Navajos. We're kind of like the Yaqui people, where we were forced to flee our reservation. Like the largest nuclear disaster in US history happened in 1978, like the same year as I think it was like 1978 by Church Rock. But we had a uranium mining spill. There is also like 200 active uranium mines on the Navajo reservation, which makes a lot of our lands uninhabitable. Also like relocation because of the Navajo Hopi Relocation Act. And just like boarding school and just not having any resources. That's why my mom moved to Phoenix. But there's been a lot of Navajos that have fled the Navajo Indian Reservation. And we actually have more Navajo Nation members in Pima County in Tucson than there are entire members listed for the Pasco Yaqui tribe. So there are, according to 2010, there was 5,000 Navajo people living in this area. I'm one of them, like me and my kids. Tucson.
We have another chat in this question in the chat. It says, is it possible to get one's hands on an actual written in response that people give to the race questions? where you could see, for an example, a misspelling or shortening of a tribal name?
I don't know. You would have to talk to the census about that kind of information. I don't have access to like individual census information.
Yeah, do you think maybe like if tribes got more involved, like tribal governments said, hey, if anything looks anything like our tribal name, could we look at it? Do you think the tribes could like, assert that kind of power?
We tried to in the 2020 and 2020, when I was a member of the Civic Engagement Program at Intertribal Council of Arizona, we did try to go to all of the county committees that oversaw the reservations. Those are called counting committees, and they're designated per county. And we did try to educate them about the different names that tribes might go by. For example, Yaqui instead of saying Pasco Yaqui tribe, or Navajo. And then we also went around to like powwows and mochulta rodeos and all kinds of dances. And we tried to go into classrooms and even now you can consider this, what we're doing here on the census overview as trying to reach out to tribes and let them know this is how you're being counted. It should be known, like make sure your tribes know this. But if you wanted to change something like on a grander scale and say like everybody who lists themselves as Yaqui or PYT or Pasco Yaqui tribe, count them as being this, that would be something that you would have to go to the US Department of Commerce in order to get them to change the administrative law. And that might actually require US Congress oversight because it's designated in the US Constitution. It would also have to be something that you'd have to go to all of the 435 US representatives to vote on that type of administrative rule change. So yeah, it's overseen by Congress. The Arizona State Legislature approves the US Arizona Census and US Congress approves the United States Census. And those are overseen by what's called administrative law. And that's controlled by both those legislatures.
Okay. So like maybe like in the future, as like tribal peoples, maybe we could just take it upon ourselves to encourage everyone who is going to be doing the census to correctly write in like the tribal name. Like for me, I would say, hey uncle, hey auntie, can you please spell out Pasco Yaqui tribe?
And then see how they spell it.
Yes.
And then see how they spell it. Because a lot of elders, like I said, like they might spell it the old way. Like they might spell it Hualapai like Wallapai, or they might spell it Moki instead of Hopi. And so that's where you have a lot of differences with elders mainly in their spelling corrections.
There you go. That's our responsibility with our elders.
So, but that was just something we noticed like when we went to senior centers. Moving on, this is looking at the citizen voting age population, which is, there's 26,000 natives that can vote in Pima County, 652,000 white people that can vote in here. These citizen voting age populations do not include those who have lost their right to vote. And so if you look, 40% of people who identify as being Hispanic, Latino, or of Spanish origin are in pre-trial, meaning that they are being actively convicted for a crime and may or may not be in jail. And so this is, and if they're in pre-trial, they're still allowed to vote. If you haven't been convicted of a crime where you'll lose your civil rights, you are still able to vote in jail. And there was a group here in Arizona who went around and made sure that jails on reservations and also jails in communities that had high minority populations had access to voting for people who were not convicted of a crime, which their civil rights would be relinquished. And if you see right here, Native peoples, even though we make up 2.4% of the population, we make up 6.75% of those held in pretrial, and we make up 8% of those failure to appear. So even though we're 2.4% of the population, 14% of our population is possibly not able to vote 14% of this 26,000 is possibly not able to vote because they're in jail or because they lost their rights to vote, civil rights. So anyhow, the Black Nation also, they only make up 3.3%. They make up 9.6% of pretrial rates. So they also, that means people over the age of 18 who would otherwise be eligible to vote aren't able to vote. And then if you consider that, and then for 2020, we don't have the over 18 populations listed yet. Those are still, Native populations take a little bit longer to dissect and present. But as of when I published my dissertation in May 2023, those numbers are not available. So of this 3,200 Pascua Yaqui members in 2010, only 2,000 of them were over the age of 18. So when you consider that the Pascua Yaqui tribe is in Maricopa and Pima counties, and you look at how many people are allowed to vote in those counties, that's what I considered voter gentrification. It's people who are moving in or around Native American communities and are offsetting our voting population by an exacerbated amount. To where even if every single member of the Pascua Yaqui tribe was eligible to vote, we still would only influence 0.06% of the actual total voting numbers. And so, summary, I'm sorry that I've gone 5 minutes over. I'm just like, in summary, the US Census is a necessary economic tool for all first world nations, especially for the United States. It's a foundation of all Christian nations as well. The US Census tells us important information about households, including and especially age, race, ethnicity. All federal funding is based on demographic information placed from the US Census, which is why it's especially important that we make sure that our brown folks become their own race, because as of now, they are relinquishing their federal funding and representation to those 15 other races that they have to identify, that they are being forced to identify as. And the US Census shows us how natives are progressing alone and in counties, but it's inaccurate. It would be a lot better if Native nations did their own consistent census, like every 10 years, if the Pascua Yaqui tribe did their own census of their own reservations and was able to use that information to give, like if we did our censuses 2 years before the 2010, like if we did our censuses like to 2028, then when the US Census did their census in 2030, we can have more of that pool. Because like if we did our own censuses, like if the Pascua Yaqui tribe did their own census, then they could make their own rules about, okay, well, anybody who registers as being Yaqui or from New Pascua or PYT, then they're counted as members. They could also look at enrollment numbers. But right now, that's not really how it's happening, but it's something that I did advocate for, that tribes start doing their own census like 2 years before the US Census, because then they could really, they would really have a case to counter like the low enrollment numbers. And it's also an important tool to use to better manage your resources and planning for tribes. It's also very helpful in elections and figuring out how we can make our vote stronger. And in general, the US Census data reveals better gentrification of PYT and Tohono communities in Arizona. So with that being said, here is the website, reddataconsulting.com. I have all of the tables listed on those websites. I am also available, Millicent, at indigenousalliance.org if you would like to talk to me more about this research that I've done. I also have listed here Lourdes's information. She's our executive director of the Indigenous Alliance. I have Dr. Gonzalez, but I should have put JS Torres. I'm so sorry. What's your email, JS?
It's jstorres@indigenousalliance.org.
Okay, yeah. So I'm sorry I didn't add that on there. I will on the next slide, but Dr. Gonzalez is another important resource here at De Alianza, and then JS Torres at indigenousalliance.org. So thank you so much for this opportunity. Next week, I will be discussing the complexities of federal, state, and county jurisdictions and how those affect Native peoples in Arizona on and off the reservations.
Okay, we have one more chat or one more question in the chat.
Mhm.
Last one, no problem if this is something you'll address later in the panel, but how does the census stuff relate to policies like blood quantum, theft of Native children by quote unquote adoption, etc.? Because it seems like they're all screwed towards the underrepresentation and fragmentation in some way.
So blood quantum, we have a group of Native peoples who do identify. You're allowed to, the US Census is self-identified. So if you want to say that you're American Indian and Alaska Native, but you are not enrolled in a tribe, you can say that you are. And you can say that you identify as being a Navajo Nation member, even if you only have an 1/8, blood count, which is also why for some nations, there's more people registered as being in a tribe than there are actually members who are enrolled in the tribe. So that's one way that blood quantum affects the US Census. But the theft of Native children by adoption, they do count all of the children in adoption, and they go by that April 1st rule. So they counted all of those kids that are in the cage, that are held in cages along the border. They did count all of the children that are in detention centers as of April 1st. And you can look up those specific information if you learn how to use the US data tables. It's a very complex system, but you can learn it. And they do have webinars, and especially like if it's like going to be 2029, they'll have more information about how to read those tables. They might not do it right now, but there is ways, and they have all of the US Census data available for corporations, for businesses, for tribes to use. That's how I was able to access all of the information that I did. It's not hidden. It's very much public information that anybody can access. And yes, please figure out how to access that and make it accessible for other people, because that's really good information that you just said. And if you can somehow figure out a fast and easy way to access that information and share it with the public, that would be really great to know that information and have it out there. And yeah, and thanks for your questions too. I appreciate them.
Yes, thank you so much, Alicia. We really appreciate that. All right, so when is our next webinar? It's next Saturday, right?
Yeah.
Next Saturday at 10 a.m. We'll be doing the same, and we'll also be giving a break in between. So I'll go ahead and send everybody off. We really appreciate you spending your morning listening in with this workshop. And if you have any other questions, anything else, please email Dr. Millicent Pepion. All right. Well, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, you guys. Have a nice day.
Yes. Bye.
Do you want me to just hang up? Okay.
Yeah.
Bye.
All right.
Okay.
See you. Yeah. I'll
Okay.
text you in a bit. Okay.
Okay, cool.
All right. Bye.